term store, what are you going to replace it with?
It's not that I don't like it. It's more painful to work with sometimes from a development point of view. So I would replace it with just a simple choice or lookup list if I was just living in that one site or site collection. But as Bill says, when you get beyond that and you're trying to use it across your tenant, absolutely, the term store makes a lot of sense.
I've used site designs before to keep my content types consistent across site collections and not have to deal with the term source. So that might be another option as well.
Right. So if you had a choice, that would propagate through those site designs.
That's smart. Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Hugo, Emily, I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right. Emily, I'm going to let you present. There you go. Awesome. So everybody can see the slides?
Yep.
Wonderful. All right. So welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about creating engaging and inclusive news for your intranet. And, we know that keeping your employees informed is very important, right? The difference between an organization that fails under adversity or one that strives really depends on that organization's ability to adapt quickly to changing business needs. Now, quickly communicating to the right people in the organization will help ensure that everyone's aware of what's happening, and it will also help increasing adoption to change. And that can make all the difference. But today, what we're going to show you is how SharePoint News is a great way to communicate to your employees easily, and how understanding to create, engaging and inclusive news in SharePoint can help you successfully convey your message and get the results you want. We absolutely, Emily and I have hours and hours worth of material, and we narrowed it down to our favorite concepts here. And the one thing I want to point out is we're absolutely coming from a perspective of consulting and looking at, we talk to all sorts of clients, and I'm sure a lot of you on the call here, we talk to clients and we're talking to them about, SharePoint News, and they barely use SharePoint News. They barely use the functionality that's there, and they're always asking for us to build the exact same capability that SharePoint News has. And that's really what our perspective is coming from. So today with me, I have coming all the way from, I think, Florida, right, Emily?
Yes, my name is Emily Mancini. I am a Master Certified User Experience Specialist by Nielsen Norman Group. So as Hugo mentioned, now I am an architect at Simpraxis Consulting, but formerly I was also a platform owner and trainer. So I do have that experience of being in an organization and trying to help shift that change management.
And maybe not as far as Florida, coming from Barrie is me, Hugo Bernier. I'm an independent consultant. I'm a office development MVP, and I'm also a member of the Patterns and Practices team. So I can be reached on my blog at tahoninjas.blog and Twitter at BernierH. So today, we're going to be talking about, again, how to leverage news, but probably more importantly, how to properly convey your message, right? So just using the SharePoint functionality is not going to cut it if you can't communicate properly. So we're going to talk about things like designing your pages and using accessibilities. And then we'll talk about how to get the actual results that you want. And hopefully in doing so, we're going to help you discover some of the functionality that SharePoint News has. If nothing else, you're going to learn some user experience tips.
All right. So let's first dive in about leveraging SharePoint News and continuing a bit on what Hugo was saying about that use case of why SharePoint News. So most company news is sent via email right now, right? But so is everything else. So it gets lost in that other sea of emails that you're getting, action items, probably some ads, everything else under the sun. And email also has a lot of its own limitations. So in addition to being in this giant sea where everything else is, all these mixed contexts, you also don't really have any organizational memory when it comes to putting news into email, right? There's no way for them to then go to the intranet and see announcements or things that have happened in the past. There can be a lot of decreased engagement with that actual news being shared because there's that dreaded either reply all accidentally to the whole company about being excited about something. You probably have limited analytics unless you purchased any add-ons to your email, so you're not getting a lot of information around who's reading your news and when. These notifications also destroy focus for your colleagues as they're popping up throughout the day. That news is probably not something that warrants them stopping what they're doing for that deliverable they're working on. There's some limited search capabilities that we have within Outlook as well. So being able to find all this previous news and consume it together, or find those key pieces of information that might impact one of my decisions of what I'm doing on a project, is pretty tough to find. There's no ability to fix errors. So as someone who previously sent out a lot of company news, there's that stressful moment as you're leading up to hitting enter, and then inevitably the moment after you send it, missing an attachment, there's a typo, or maybe even someone asks a great question and you want to add that content to that original news piece. That email is just a one moment in time. And last but not least, no integration into Microsoft 365. So if everybody is living in Teams and SharePoint, they're not necessarily seeing these emails and this information in that context where they're getting all their work done. So what SharePoint News gives us is it centralizes all of our internal and external news. It really supports this ability to curate rich internal news and also link to those external news sources. Even better, you can create news digests, kind of like the concept of a newsletter, to roll up any of those top pieces of information and make sure that your organization can see them and stay up to date on that information. And that's regardless of the source of where they came from. News posts can also be made from any site, which supports that decentralized content model that is recommended for your intelligent intranet for SharePoint Online Modern. This is a little bit different than the typical news process, because usually if it's going through an email, there's one person curating it. Everything has to go through that one person before it gets out. That can cause a lot of delays with the latest and freshest updates going out. So going towards this decentralized model and actually empowering all of these different site owners to immediately share their news also gives you the ability to give those updates a bit faster. Because this is such an inherent shift in how companies traditionally share news, this is where people get a little bit nervous. So a lot of what we're going to focus on today is about creating some governance around that news and these best practices to make sure that we are supporting all of these different site owners and subject matter experts to be sharing their news effectively. One important thing to know about your SharePoint news is that that will inherently increase the more sources that you have. So Metcalfe's law states that the value of a network is equal to the number of nodes squared, right? So the more connections you have, the greater value of that network. I remember back when me and only one of my friends had a cell phone, and it wasn't really awesome, right? Because we would just call each other. It wasn't such a wide network. So as you're increasing the number of groups who are empowered and willing to share their news with SharePoint, that intranet news is going to become a lot more valuable. Your intranet becomes that central resource for all news. Instead of having to check your email, also SharePoint, maybe an external website for those press releases. You're giving everyone everything in one central spot. So now that we understand some of the value of news, I'm going to stop trying to sell you on that aspect of it and suspend your disbelief of how great it is. And we're going to dive into this really quick 3-minute video of posting news, just for illustration purposes only. You're probably going to spend more time on your news stories proportional to how important they are. So if you have, let's say, your company's being acquired, that's not a news post you're going to write in 5 minutes. That's probably something that a lot of thought is going to go into that. So let's first take a look at our news post. Now, behind the scenes, what I'm making right now is just a SharePoint page. So if I explain it that way, kind of a boring demo, right? We're just using sections and web parts, everything that we've used before. So this should all be intuitive and really easy for us to go through, something you've seen a bunch of different times. Essentially, what's happening behind the scenes in your site pages library is you have a site column called promoted state, and we're adding a different promoted state to it. As I'm going through making this page, just a couple of other things to call out that we can't necessarily do with email out of the box, again, unless we have some of those third-party options. in this news post, I'm talking about a location because this is Kintoso Travel and we are marketing excursions. So I want to make sure everyone in my company knows a bit more about Bazaar Sabado. So in this, I'm actually able to add more rich content. I can add in maps, I can embed documents, I can add videos and pictures. That's not something you can always do so easily with your separate emails. And at the end of the day, when it comes to using this news, consuming this information, the aesthetic usability principle applies. It cites that when someone perceives something as aesthetically pleasing, an aesthetically pleasing design, we actually think that's more usable. So if we're able to make more attractive news in SharePoint, people are going to find consuming that same news that you're sharing actually more supportive, more inclusive, and more helpful for their jobs. So making these rich pages, including these pictures, this additional context, can actually help support having people want to consume this news as well. Now, skipping off of our demo of kind of creating and building out that page, I have great news for you. I mentioned that under the covers, SharePoint News is actually site pages. So if you already have site pages right now that are actually dynamic content, not that static content, you can promote them to be news, add this news web part to your homepage, and begin diving into SharePoint News right away. So let's take a peek at this Surfing in Hawaii page. In our top navigation, we have Promote, and then I select Post News on Site. Now, I can also choose to email these different individual news posts as well, so I can help bring the news to the people where they are. Last but not least, I called out, so we just saw how we can make news within our SharePoint environment. I mentioned that we can pull in external content as well. And we can do that with a news link. Your company might be sharing a lot of news externally that's important for those employees to see. So instead of recreating that on your intranet or sending them an email and asking them to go elsewhere, you can grab that URL and add it as a news link. It'll appear right in that SharePoint web part and it'll have the same experience as your other news stories. So here we have an external article on San Francisco Gate. I'm just going to copy this URL. I go to add, and this time I'm doing news link. So my first step is to pop in that URL, and then it's going to give me the option to have that thumbnail image change my title and description. You might want to put this external news a little bit into context for your colleagues in that description to explain why you're bringing this in. Give them a nice, strong information sent about what is going to be helpful from this article. And we'll talk a little bit more about information sent and information foraging later, if that's a new concept for you. But who's really coming to our intranet to see this news? Our employees are used to getting it delivered to their inbox. This is usually the other gate that we have in conversations. So I'm going to pass it over to Hugo. Let's talk a little bit about all the places that SharePoint News appears.
Thank you. So one of the things that Emily mentioned is SharePoint News reaches the employees where they are. And it's absolutely true. And it's something that's very different from, let's say, an email, because one of the things that you have with SharePoint News is that the news can show up on the start page, right? So when you go to the SharePoint central page where it shows all your sites, it'll actually roll up all your news that for all the sites that you belong to all in one place. The other place where that's going to be handy is on the SharePoint mobile app page, SharePoint mobile app, where the news will be rolled up as well. Thank you, Emily.
Sorry about that.
No, that's no problem. You can also add the SharePoint News to Microsoft Teams, right? So more and more we see organizations that are using Microsoft Teams as their kind of, I open this and I keep this open all day, and that's my place to access everything. So to be able to access my SharePoint News through Microsoft Teams is a great way to do this. Now, there's also a web part that you can install, and that web part allows you can configure it pretty much on any site collection that you want, and you can surface only that site collection's news or a filtered view of the site's news, or include news from other sites, including a roll-up of like basically all the sites that are part of a hub. The other option that's available, if you want to go back to like 1990, is you can actually send your news to email, And I joke about that because obviously, if you're able to get people to come to your news as opposed to sending news via email, you certainly get a lot more benefits. But the reality is there are still organizations that insist on being able to send news to email. And I understand as well that some clients might not be able to have everybody visit the news at all times. We have some, send Yammer, thank you. Send Yammer to Teams, or send to Yammer, sorry, and Teams is something that's available now. But one of the features that's coming up shortly is the SharePoint app bar. And the SharePoint app bar, I don't know, it's kind of like the Yeti, right? It's something that few people have seen, and it's been reported out there in the wilderness. It hasn't shown up yet, but here's a preview of what the SharePoint app bar is going to look like. Across the board, you're going to be able to go to SharePoint and you're going to have this kind of navigation that's going to be available. So you're going to see your sites, but here you're also going to see the news, and the news are going to be rolled up from all around, all across the sites that you have access to. And that includes as well your files. So this is something that's coming up. Again, I can't make any promises as to when it's going to happen, but I have started to see it on some tenants. So hopefully that's a sign of things to come. If you and the cool thing about this is the SharePoint app bar is also something that's going to be consistent and available within Teams as well. So you're going to be able to leverage that functionality. So for all of you who have worried about creating MegaNav or creating SharePoint extensions to add navigation to all the sites, hopefully that's going to be a thing of the past. And the commitment is that this SharePoint app bar eventually is going to be configurable and customizable. So I'm looking forward to that.
Me too.
All right. So the other thing that we want to talk about is reaching the right people with audience targeting. So one of my clients has offices in Toronto. The head office is in Toronto, but they have offices in Montreal, they have offices in Vancouver and Calgary. And invariably what happens is the head office people will always be sending messages to everyone in the company because that's their perspective. And it's going to be stuff like, hey, everyone, there's muffins in the cafeteria. And, the employee bake sale is going on right now, and go buy samosas in the lunchroom. And everybody in the company is getting these messages, right? And if we had more time, we'd definitely talk about the cost of sending an email to everyone and what that means. But that's one of the things we're trying to do with audience targeting is we're trying to say, let's not just like broadcast to every single person known to man. Let's actually do the holy grail of marketing, which is understand our audience and target our news to that audience. So to enable audience targeting to news, the first thing that you need to do, obviously, is, you need to actually set it up. So let's do that. So we'll just click next on the slide. There you go. So the first thing we do is we'll go to the site content and the site pages where your news are hosted. It's like my video is sleepy today. There you go. It was taking some time catching up. So we'll go to site pages and we'll go to the site settings. And in the site settings, there's a feature called audience targeting setting. I know they tend to hide those features with weird names. And then we'll actually just check enable audience targeting. And what that's going to do, I think behind the scenes, is it's adding a few columns to the library that we're going to be able to leverage. Now we can go back to the home page and we can go to the next step, which is going to be to, if you can click next, please, Emily. So we've recorded these, by the way, because we've had problems in the past with some of these events not working properly when we're doing it live. So now if I go to a page, the page where my news web part is hosted, I click on properties. One of the features that is available now is enable audience targeting. So if you click on that and you close that, now we have this cool new feature, right? We're going to republish that and now we're ready. So now the next step is, there you go. Now the next step is actually when I create my news, I can just write, my news page like I normally would. But before I submit my news, one of the options that should be there now is the audiences. So with audiences, unfortunately, it's not the good old audiences that some of you may be familiar with, where you could create audiences based on properties and attributes and things like that. But I can actually target to groups. So for example, if I'm using the example of the cafeteria menu, right, I can actually target now this news to only the people from the Toronto head office. So those are very simple steps that quite often a lot of users don't know how to do. I recommend you set that up first thing when you set up a site, especially if you know that you're not going to be maintaining that site, but someone else is going to be doing that. Make it easier for them. All right. And Emily, is it me talking about this? Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries.
So the other thing that you can do, because now what's going to happen is if you consider that every site or site collection and every group pretty much can have news, you might have some people in your company that are concerned, right? They're going usually they're the marketing team or the corporate communication team. They're saying, well, wait a minute, our news are more important than the rest of the company's news, right? Yeah, that may be true. So one of the things that you can do with news is that you can actually mark a site as the declarative company news. So then you'll go to that organizational news site, let's say, /news or whatever, or in this case, travel, and using one line of PowerShell, you can actually make that site the official news, and it'll have a special tag like this. So again, next time you talk to the corporate communication people and they say the CEO's message is the most important piece of news, and it has to be differentiated and distinguished from the social committee's news, that's how you would do that. Now, there's a way that we can create News Digest, and why don't we get Emily to talk to us about News Digest?
Absolutely. So we had a question while you were talking, Hugo, in the chat around as orgs empower more people, to distribute and create news in this fashion, how do we handle that information overload? So you're right, Jason, that was a perfect cue up for Hugo talking about audience targeting. I think also that organizational news, kind of calling out what is that declarative news, as well as using now these news digests, which are available today, as a way to roll up those top news stories and send them into people's inboxes. Before I dive into that news digest, the other things that are coming up this year that I'm really excited for are some boost news features. So in the future, you'll be able to pick a news story, for example, and you could say, leave this as the top story until everyone in the organization has read it, for example. So if you have something going back to that merger and acquisition news, and you want to make sure everybody has set eyes on it before it's not their top story, that's something you'll be able to control. Right now, you can do that news organization manually, but I don't typically recommend it because it's something you have to remember and go back and do. I'm much more a fan of set it and forget it for when you want it to be featured and then no longer up in that top spot. So coming back to our news digest, think of this again as your next generation newsletter. It can be sent to email, but on the back end, it's actually creating a SharePoint page at the same time. So I'm capturing that moment in time of what I'm saying is that addition, and it's increasing that organizational memory that we are missing when we're sending them only as emails. It's helpful for new employees to understand recent history. And it could also be helpful for some of these long-term roles as they shift. Maybe I shift into marketing and communications at my organization, and I want to see historically what they've shared in the past. This gives me a good place to look and come up to speed. So let's take a look at actually making one. You need to have at least 4 stories before you can get that See All button. And then it'll show you all news stories you have in your news web part. You can choose non-continuous stories. So first you want to select them all, the ones that you want to have. Then we can hit the next button, go into creating that news digest. When you name it, that's going to be the name of your SharePoint page as well. It's not going to capture who you sent it to or that description that you send in the email. It will just capture this layout of the news stories below, which I can drag and drop to reorder. So this is what that page will look like at the end of the day. Now, what it's doing when you send that to your email, that picture, the title are all clickable to get to that different news post, right? So you're pulling people into the intranet. Another question I get often when we talk about that piece, because this is what that news digest looks like in email, is, well, this is my company news, but it looks like it's Microsoft's news. Well, one option I can tell you today, forward it to yourself. It's just a table. Delete out those images, do the branding that you want. But at Ignite, they did say that company branded news digests were coming end of 2020. So to me, it's been an extra long year. Let's consider January still 2020. Hopefully any day now. I can't wait to see it.
I think they meant the 2020s.
Yeah, we'll see, right? Now that we understand why we want to leverage that news and how to create those pages themselves, which is great, already how we knew to create SharePoint pages already, let's talk about conveying those messages, which is so crucial.
Thank you.
Hugo, can you kick us off?
I certainly can. So this is something someone really wise one day told me this, and I loved it. So I always, every opportunity I have to share this, I try to share it. They told me that the definition of communicating is to convey a message that results in a change in behavior. And that sounds really cheesy, but if you think about it, right, if you're just spewing, emails and news and things like that, and you're not getting people to change what you want them to change, then are you really communicating? Or are you just making noise? So what a big part of this presentation today is going to be about is about finding ways to more efficiently communicate by using news. And probably the first thing to do is how we structure news. Emily, do you want to talk about this fancy pyramid?
Absolutely. So the most important thing that we need to think about when writing our news is that writing for the web is different because how people read on the web is different than how they read a sheet of paper. People scan and move pretty quickly. So our first tip is to write in an inverted pyramid because this ensures that our most critical point is at the top of the page and you're progressively disclosing more information as you go down the page. What that means is if I am a site visitor and my colleague might be really busy, they see this piece of news, they click on it, they read the first couple sentences, they could then decide, oh, this really applies to me, I want to dive deeper. Maybe that organization wasn't using audience targeting yet, or maybe they read that top thing and say, okay, this breaking news doesn't impact my day, I'll read this at the end of the day. So you know that people get at least that top piece of information. I do recommend writing this way for all of your SharePoint content, so it's not just news. So to actually write in that inverted pyramid structure to match those web reading patterns, the first thing you'll need to do is identify your key points. Stream of consciousness news is not really effective, so make sure that you know that change in behavior that you're trying to drive. While you're identifying those key points, you'll then be able to say, okay, which one is secondary information? What's not really my critical pieces? And those might be the little content chunks and headers that you have later further down your pyramid. Again, people are scanning, so you want to write really concisely. And of course, always write well because you have this large audience. Think about things like not using jargon or colloquialisms, especially if you are a global company, because that's not something that translates very well. We want to be really clear and concise. One way to support these different content chunks as you're writing in this inverted pyramid is to front load all of your elements. So if I have a piece of HR news about benefits, I don't want to start each section HR benefit : medical, HR benefit : dental. People are reading too much ahead of that, and Hugo will talk a little bit more about that later as well. And then my last recommendation is consider adding a summary. One of my favorite tricks is if you have a really long news post, and let's say you have that top key point, you have that top overview, maybe you want to use something like a 1/3 right section. And you can actually use anchor links to the different headers that you have throughout your news post. So when I'm hopping and I'm looking at that top of my pyramid, I see the overview of what it's about, and then it almost serves as a table of contents of the other information. And it's also a shortcut for me later. Let's say it was benefits during open enrollment. I was like, remind me about those dental changes again. I can just click that and hop further down into the page. Now, speaking of that page structure, there is a lot about that that can affect how people read or don't read your content.
Yes. So really how you structure your page can really influence people, right? The structure can make your content solid, or it can make it crumble like a house of cards, right? So things like eye gazing, right? So where people are actually looking and understanding where people look can help you influence what people do. One thing to understand is that people have a tendency to, as Emily said, they read the first a few words of every paragraph. In average, they will read the first 2 words, or about 11 characters of every major headline. So again, as Emily said, if every single news item that you write and every heading starts with Contoso, blah, 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 Contoso, blah, 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 people are not actually going to be able to understand. They're not going to get a sense of what you're trying to talk about. And again, I know we all think that people want to read everything. The reality is we're just hardwired not to be able to do that. And with that in mind, I hear this all the time, right? Every single client says, "Oh, no, my employees, they can't wait to read the news," right? It's the first thing they want to do when they come in. I'm here to tell you that you're not you're not an exception. The majority of employees don't want to read your news, right? So if you think that that's what they're expecting, you're mistaken. Now they have better things to do, right? They have their own jobs to do, and you may think, well, they should read my company's news because it's part of their job. But research shows that people don't read computer screens the same way they read on paper. And the sooner you recognize that, the sooner you can correct that behavior from your users by adapting your change structure and break unhealthy reading patterns. In fact, there's studies that show that you can get up to 124% better usability by adopting some of these principles. So what are some of those principles? The first thing is the default F-shape reading pattern, right? So what they did here, and this is really cool. This is coming from Nielsen Norman Group. They put infrared cameras pointed to people's eyes, and then they shot infrared lights on people's eyes, and they just recorded how people were looking at a page. And what you see here is the parts that are brighter, yellow and red, are parts that people actually look at. And the parts that are darker are the parts where people really barely scan. So the one thing that they found is in the absence of subheadings and bullets, users tend to fixate on the words towards the beginning of the lines and the top of the page. And that's why it's called the F reading pattern. Now, in left to right languages, the text on the left and towards the top of the page is read more than the text on the right or towards the bottom of the page. And this is something that is often called the Gutenberg rule, or the reading gravity. And people really try to minimize their interaction costs and maximize the benefit that they get from the work that they do. So for their eyes, what this translates to is spending few fixations. And fixations are when we just stop and look at things. So they want to do as few fixations as possible while gleaning the information they need to be productive and engaged and successful, and from what they take from those fixations. So the economy of time here means fewer fixations. So in some cases, people will get really bored and fatigued as they scan the text. And other times, really the words that they read often offer a weak information set. So they're getting the vibe that this is not worth their time. So they just, because we're all about self-gratification and getting the most of everything as quickly as possible, they might just abandon quickly. So we'll just go through those bullets quickly, and then we'll go to the next slide here.
Whoops, sorry. I went
No, that's
really
okay.
quick.
I'm flying through this today. So the antidote is the page structure. Now, I want to be clear, the page that I have on the right is not necessarily like, I don't even think it's a SharePoint page, really. But it's a page that when you look at it from a high level, you can quickly see that there's some headings, there's some things that draw your attention, and those are the things that I wanted to point your attention to. So the first thing, as Emily said, is you want the most important points in the first two paragraphs of the page. Right? Use headings and subheadings because, and you want to make sure that they look more important, right, and more visible. You want the normal text to be different from the headings and footers, or headings and subheadings, sorry, because that's what actually people are going to scan for. And always start your headings and your subheadings with the words that carry the most information, right? Again, keep in mind, people will only read, in most cases, the first two words of every headline of every paragraph. And I know that sounds scary, and I know you might even say, no, I read the whole thing. As you know, typically, and again, this is not me saying this is the study that's saying this, is typically if you read more, it's because you found that you're actually getting value out of the first two words that you're reading, and you continue reading. That's the information set that we talked about before. So if people read only the first two words of every paragraph and every headline, you want to write it in such a way that they get the most value out of it and they actually understand what you're trying to do. You also want to visually group small amounts of related content. So for example, by surrounding them with like a border or using a different background. And this is something that's available out of the box with SharePoint Modern Pages, where you can use section colors or you can use rulers to divide sections. And that actually helps people. And again, I know we really want people to read everything, but again, what we're trying to do here is the antidotes to getting people to read. You also want to bold the important words and phrases, right? So this is kind of like the equivalent of how the NHL was highlighting the puck a while ago to try to make it easier for people to follow where the puck was. I know people didn't like that in the NHL, but this is something that in Modern Pages and any web content, highlighting the keywords and the phrases is actually useful for people. You definitely want to take advantage of the different formatting of links and ensure that the links include information bearing words, right? So don't ever say go blah, 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 or click here or more. Because that, again, when people just scan through stuff, it means nothing to them. So if instead you make your link something concrete that tells people what they're going to get by clicking on the link, it improves accessibility for users who hear the links and read aloud, like people with screen readers. But it also helps with people who just are super busy, right? And then use bullets and numbers to call out items as a list in or a process, because what that does is we're hardwired to actually skip to those and use them. And then, if necessary, cut unnecessary content. There you go. Thank you. And let's talk about the Gestalt principle. So the Gestalt principle is it's a principle that basically you can use containers to create groupings. So I've mentioned it a little bit before, where I was saying, you know, take advantage of things like section backgrounds and dividers. Well, this is a great way here. And again, this page here, I just randomly took a SharePoint page, but you see how we're using colors and blocks here to create things. So the items within a boundary are always perceived as a group, and they are assumed to share some common characteristics, right? So use background colors, spacings, borders to group information. And, you know, just keep in mind because again, people love to do this. Keep in mind that you should always be respectful of contrast colors. All right, so on the next page, there's something that people don't often seem to know or they don't seem to use is section background. You can just go to a page and you can go to a section and you can actually select the section background color. So for example, this is a really ugly page, by the way. What I'm trying to show here is how you can leverage section colors to highlight different parts. And if you break your section, your content into sections, you can actually help guide your users into reading more content. And again, just make sure you don't mix apples and oranges in section contents. You really want to logically group topics together so that people understand, because people will skip content if they have to. All right, and one example of how to use section colors is the SharePoint Lookbook. And the SharePoint Lookbook, if you haven't used it, or if you haven't visited it, I strongly recommend you go take a look. You have some of the most awesome designers at Microsoft that are creating really awesome content for SharePoint. And the cool thing about the lookbook is that not only it can inspire you and give you some ideas, but a lot of these, well, all these templates are actually things that you can go install automatically on your SharePoint site. In some cases, you have to give permissions to do stuff on your SharePoint site, but it'll actually create all this content for you. So, for example, when COVID started, there was a new template on the SharePoint Lookbook that helped you create kind of a content a section for COVID, and people could get started by just adding their own content. But they use section colors extensively, as you can see on some of the screenshots here, and it's a great source of inspiration for using that. All right, Emily, do you want to talk about maybe some ways to create some page templates?
Absolutely, give you a break. So now that, earlier we were talking about this idea, we have this decentralized content model, all of these different people creating news. Well, we also want to create some consistency because we don't want people to have to relearn how to find information each time they're reading a different news post because a different person wrote it. Also, at the end of the day, a lot of these subject matter experts who are sharing news, they're not communications or marketing people, so they may not know all of these usability principles or the best ways to write for the web. So the best way to set them up for success is potentially making some of these page templates and providing guidance on these better practices to increase consistency in how that news is shared across the organization. And again, better support those subject matter experts and their ability to convey the critical messages, which also frees up your time or those communication teams' time to focus on other projects. So let's take a peek at how to make a page template. So after you have made a page, instead of posting this in that drop down by Save as Draft, we can actually click that and select Save as Template. And then name this template, and it's now available in a newly created templates folder within your site pages library. You can actually navigate there and update and change that page template over time as well. Now, page templates are specific to each site collection. So if you want to have these page templates across your different environments, you will need to consider some other solutions. You could use a third-party migration tool or recreate these pages in the different site collections. If you're looking more the automation route, Site Designs does not support making page layouts, but the PNP provisioning templates do. I identify as a non-dev, but I have been dangerously playing around with these. You do need to know a little XML and PowerShell, and I have been loving it and finding it very powerful. So I do recommend taking a little exploration into those to get your consistent frameworks across your site collections. Now, cool, that's how we make them, but what is it like to use it? And this is the even better part. So from new and then news post, you'll notice now we have this news template option for us. When we click on it, we can even see it on the right side and see what that layout's going to be. My favorite way that people use page templates is to actually put the governance and training in the page itself and tell people what to do in each section. So again, we're reducing that gulf of execution, and we're giving people the content that they need when they need it, where they are. And that's also true for the posters, not just for the people who are reading it. Hugo made a really useful tool for non-technical users to begin exploring these layouts outside of SharePoint. I swear I say this even when he's not around. Tell us more about your SharePoint wireframes.
Yeah, so what I found it was painful to try to communicate to stakeholders, how their SharePoint site could look like, because if I would do a SharePoint site, they would start focusing on, oh, wait a minute, this picture is wrong, or this is the wrong color, or things like that. So I went completely the other end of the spectrum, and instead of using a tool like Balsamiq or Illustrator or something like that, I created a PowerPoint presentation. It seems like nowadays my biggest coding tool is PowerPoint. So this is a PowerPoint slide that's available for you. You can download it, and it's got placeholders, like for example, this one here, which is a page template for the 3-column layout. And inside of that PowerPoint template, there's lots of content that you can copy and paste, and it's got those squiggly lines in that weird font to make it obvious to your stakeholders that this is not intended to be the final product. This is just for illustration purposes. And I promise you, it really helps facilitate a conversation where people are not focusing on the wrong thing.
Speaking of focusing.
Yes, speaking of focusing, the one thing you should be careful about is how you use images. And I know people are going to go, they're like, oh, I can use images. But there's two types of images, right? There's decorative, if I can say that word, there's decorative images that make your pages look pretty, but they tend to put the information down on the page. They have value, but they can, they can support the brand and the tone of the voice, but you have to be careful not to overdo it to the point where people want to get to the actual content. And then the other type of images are information carrying images. And those ones are good. They convey information. They can be like a product image or for something you sell, or maybe a person's photo, right? And it adds a lot of value to your readers. And they actually, again, if we look at heat maps, right, from studies, they will spend a lot more time looking at them. You have to remember that, we're all experienced with internet now. We've been trained to treat generic images like banner ads, and we tend to ignore them. We're just hardwired. So if you use like stock photography, to try to convey information, it often just gets ignored. We're just hardwired to do that. But real images, for example, images of people that they recognize, will get their attention. So use your CEO, right? Your employees that are smiling, people that are real, that people recognize. People will automatically have a tendency to look at those people and use that to your advantage. But you want to pay attention to where you place the image on the page. And if there are people on that image, pay attention to where they're looking at. So for example, look at this image here. This is Emily's boss, right? Mark Henderson. And so if you look at if you've ever seen him in the community, you probably paid attention to him, especially because he's been there the whole time I was talking. But look at where he's looking right now, right? He's looking way over there, away from the text. And so I don't know why I did that. I guess he's got laser powers. But let's just change that presentation, that image for a second, and let's make him point towards the text. Now you notice how immediately what you probably did is you probably started looking at the title of the slide. And that's exactly what the behavior is, right? So use real people, use decorative images as little as possible. I'm trying to remember the proper word for that in English, but as little as possible. And be careful about where people look because people are influenced. And there's all sorts of studies on that, including things even like if you stack things in a diagonal shape, people will read from top to bottom left to top right or top left to bottom right. So you can actually force people to look at where you want them to look by using some of these shapes. That's a trick that's used in magazines all the time. So in terms of image size guidelines, you want to make sure that we're using the right images. So these are the guidelines, and I don't need to read them here, but this is actually something that, again, my PowerPoint template that I created already has these image sizes predefined. You can take advantage of that as well. And those are the best for basically optimal reading. So now let's talk about getting the results that you want, right? So far, we've talked to you about how to leverage SharePoint for the news. We've talked about how to create your message in a way that people will actually read it. But there's still a little bit more here, because what we're trying to do is we've made people read. Now we want to get the results that we're expecting. And I'd love to have Emily talk to us about this.
So earlier, Hugo and I both kept dropping this term of information sent. So there's this idea, right? In the world of animals, and I love using the example of truffle pigs, animals want to spend the least amount of calories possible to go find their food, right? So the stronger the scent, the more confident they are, more willing they are to probably use those calories. Those pigs are digging for those truffles. Similar for information foraging with your colleagues, right? So we want to decrease that interaction cost for people to find content. We want to make sure that they're spending the least amount of energy to find out what's important to them. So that concept, right, their information foraging is providing that strong information scent. One of the ways that you can do that is removing that gulf of execution and putting whatever content you're trying to share with them right there in your page. So let's take a peek here. For example, I'm sharing something that is supported by a document. You can just embed that document right into that news post. Because remember, this cognitive effort is currency. All your colleagues have their own jobs. They're extremely busy. If you make a news post about this new press release and then you don't tell them where it is, you're asking them to do more work to have that result in that change in behavior. So you're removing any of that friction for them to go to that next step. Another option, sometimes you can't embed something into a page. Maybe it's not appropriate, not the best look for the story. So maybe you want to place a link next to that step. Hugo was talking about that law of common regions, and keep that in mind when you're structuring your content. So here we are, right? We're using a 1/3 right column. So we're saying, hey, this is Bizarre Sabado for Quintoso Travel. If you want to advertise this to some of our clients and have them sign up for excursion training, here immediately next to it is my call to action to keep them moving on to that next step for that change in behavior I want them to do. And I'm keeping it contextually paired. Also remember that this link is a promise. So if I'm saying sign up for excursion training, I better not drop them on a training homepage, because then they have to look through that training to then find information about how to book these excursions, right? There's this law in user experience called peak end rule. So people remember how they felt at the beginning and the end of your task. So we've just spent about 50 minutes talking about all the ways to have that wonderful peak initial point. You don't want to lose them right now at the end of your news story because you gave them a bad link and you broke a promise. Even worse if they get a permissions error. Another thing that Hugo was mentioning was around our link labels and being really clear about this. How many people have seen this before? Beach, learn more. City, learn more. Not really giving me a lot of information sent. Really big opportunity missed here to support my information foraging. It's also not accessible for those people using screen readers, as Hugo mentioned, because this link doesn't stand alone. I'm just going to hear learn more, learn more, learn more. I'm not going to know it's in context of beach, city, and wilderness. It can also be pretty challenging for people with visual spatial processing challenges. So instead, what we recommend is focusing on the 4S for encouraging clicks from Nielsen Norman Group. So be specific, avoid jargon and generic language, be sincere. You want to deliver on that link of the promise. It needs to be substantial, so it's long enough to differentiate and stand alone. So you'll see I just changed that slide. Beach, get some sun. City, take in culture. Wilderness, observe nature. Those are the different benefits I'm going to have for those different travel types. And then last but not least, I asked you to be specific, sincere, and substantial, but I'm also asking you to be succinct. You don't want it to be so long that we lose our readers, because as Hugo was mentioning earlier, there is a limited attention span when it comes to reading all of these words in these separate sections. So today we showed you how to easily leverage SharePoint to make more impactful news that successfully conveys your messages and gets the results you want by reducing that friction for your end users to lead them towards that change in behavior that you are seeking. I know we have some more time for questions, so I'll just leave this resources slide. These are all of the different studies and resources we had at the bottom of each slide, grouped by the providers to help you on your news journey after today.
Thank you, everyone. We're here for questions. And I have to mention that last slide that Emily showed with the links. The one thing you'll notice is those links were all also inspiring, right? They're all positive. They're all kind of forward-looking. You know, let's do this. Let's get started. And this is also a great voice to use when you create these links. Believe it or not, we have a tendency to follow what people say, you know, what people that don't know what they want to write, they'll have a tendency to use questions instead. And questions are often not as engaging. It's, you know, it's better to actually say, let's do this, right? Let's go get some sun, as opposed to say, you know, would you like to get some sun? Because then you're actually opening a conversation about, well, do I really want to or not? And you're just, again, you want to get straight to that instant gratification. But thank you, everyone, for listening to us. Here we are talking about attention span and carrying information, and we go on for an hour and a bit.
Thanks for bearing with us. We're both very passionate about UX.
It shows. That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jason, I apologize. Hopefully I was not making you seasick.
Oh, of course, I was just kidding, Hugo, of course.
I couldn't resist smiling at that one.
That was good. I just started using a stand-up desk, and I'm not, for someone who's been sitting for the last 30 years or something all day long, this is a new experience for me. My back starts hurting me as soon as I stand up, so I'm sure I'll get better.
Well, I'm a standing office person as well, so I get what you're talking about.
I've been thinking about it. It looks like a good idea.
Does anybody have any questions about how to leverage news? And hopefully there was some tidbits in there that were new to people. Hopefully.
Yes.
Good.
I do have a question. In having this conversation, who is it in the organization that generally gravitates to this message?
Ooh, I'm sure we'll have different answers. I'll start off. So I would say a lot of the organizations that I have been working with, I'm often paired with the individual site owners. And so sometimes that will come from corporate communications and marketing of like, well, this is the way we communicate news. And then it's a conversation of, well, here's another way to do it and to empower your end users. So typical answer, sure, marketing communications, but it can be a lot of the different individual groups as well, because this news is also available in team sites. So sometimes I'm meeting with clients and they're having engagement collaboration challenges, or they're growing quickly and they're the employees don't really feel confident about where to find what information, and clear decision making isn't happening, and their whole world is living in Teams and they don't also want to go to SharePoint. So giving them an option that could bring this news to the varied places people are, sometimes that's where it comes from as well. What about you, Hugo?
Well, it's interesting because it's often corporate communication folks who are, their typical answer is, this is how we've done news this way. We've always done news this way. and we don't want to change. And this SharePoint news is something we never really asked for, or IT's forced down our throat, so we want to continue doing this. So to me, it's always about conveying that message of, well, again, it's the point. I'm trying to get them to have a change in behavior, but are you really communicating to people, or are you just making noise? And the one thing that you don't get with sending emails is you can see how many people received the email. You can even sometimes see how many people opened the email, but you certainly can't see how many people actually read the message in the email. So one trick that I always talk about is create links to your news from your email, so at least you can see the click-through. But like Emily said, I think that often some of the individual groups, it's often the groups that are most invested in seeing people, actually communicate and making a change in behavior. Like HR is often really open to this, often more than the corporate communication people. Because basically we're telling corporate communication people, you haven't been communicating properly so far. And that's always not always a message they're happy to hear.
But we can help you.
Yes, we can help you. And keep in mind, there's lots of people that come from, like, especially people in marketing and corporate communication. They often come from a legacy, printed media background and things like that, and they haven't necessarily had the opportunity to adjust their attitudes towards online. And how we used to structure pages even 5 years ago is very different than it is today. Like, I remember talking about above the fold and below the fold, which is not even a thing anymore.
It's
right?
kind of gone now. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's how I usually try to kind of, positioning it. It's not that you don't know what you're doing, is that people are evolving. Their online attitude has evolved, and it's important for you to adjust yourself so that you deliver the message you want.
And Jason made a good point in the chat earlier, kind of about how, from a Microsoft perspective, people are saying, how can we use your stuff more effectively? More often than not, I'm actually working on an intranet implementation with a client while they're also trying to implement some other solution for news. And then I'm like, raise my hand like, hey, just want to check in with your features. Like, you already have all of that stuff in Microsoft. Are you sure you want to pay for that? And then also pay to integrate it with your intranet. And I have been knock on wood, 100% success rate so far moving over to SharePoint News, because everything that Microsoft has built is serving those needs. As Hugo pointed out in the beginning of the conversation, sometimes you're getting that as a request for a custom build. One of the other things coming soon I didn't mention that I also love is that time to read. So in the top above the title and name, we're also going to have those metrics of like, this article's 4 minutes, right, for you to read and give people a little bit more information about opting into those news. And that's those analytics and the time to read are usually the top 2 items that I hear from clients that they need. The third being that news digest. Because it's called digest, some people don't think of it as newsletter. So as long as you bridge that gap, you'll probably end up meeting a lot of their needs.
One thing that we didn't talk about was around engagement and things like liking and commenting and turning news into a two-way vehicle. Thoughts on that side?
Great point. I guess we did say that in our negatives, right, of email, and then didn't comment about the fact that there are those comment threads. People do have the ability to engage with the news without spamming the whole company. Sometimes companies get worried about, well, if someone makes a comment, are they ever going to see it? Kind of like your tree falls in a forest. You can @mention people, and then they'll get that notification of being in those comments. So maybe you @mention someone else that you want to see the news. But even the ability just to give a thumbs up, maybe you don't have the words to express some initiative, some cultural initiative that your company's doing, but you want to show them that you're happy about it. It does give you more options than you would have with email, which is a little bit more pressure sometimes. What do you think?
And I have to think, that simple thumbs up is really powerful. If I'm scanning 20 articles and one of them has 500 likes on it, if I haven't read it, I'm probably going to go look at it.
Yeah, true.
What's everybody else excited about here?
Very good point.
And I'm sure that Jason can talk more about this, but with just the improved search and even Project Cortex, right? The fact that it's going to be able to take advantage of the fact that people are looking at, people in my team are looking at this article, will eventually help bubble up this article higher in search results than other things. So that's great. Again, it's about getting the news to the people who care about it in the most efficient way. I still struggle with customers that say, "Oh, I don't want to allow comments because people are going to write stupid things." And to which I always say, "Well, yeah," but it's like, yeah, but you give everyone an email address and they can email the world, right?
Yeah.
So people don't do that. They don't send stupid emails because, again, they want to keep their job, and there's an acceptable IT usage policy. So talking about enabling social features, if you want to call them that, in news and things like that, is just everyone's ability to contribute and help bring awareness to these things.
Yeah.
You can also delete the comments if someone said something inappropriate, so it is reversible.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Which you can't really do with email, right?
Before their exit interview. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Again,
Other questions,
seriously, we have
comments
like
on
4
the
hours
field?
worth of material.
I do have to say, I mean, this isn't just applicable to news. I mean, we got a couple folks on our team that do content marketing, and I'm going to be playing them this recording to say, hey, as you're building your blog articles, all the same rules apply here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we had a whole section about, how to phrase your headings and your lead and your but again, we tried to cover everything in 1 hour. There's a lot more material, but if you look at those resources that are on the screen right now, they're a good starting point to give you a lot of inspiration.
And one thing I'll kind of call out, this was SharePoint news heavy, but I totally acknowledge that there's different organization sizes and therefore different news needs. So there's this article on Microsoft Community Docs about how to share org-wide communications in Microsoft 365. And it talks about Yammer, org-wide Teams, SharePoint News, email, and pros and cons of each. So you might make different choices depending on the persistence of message, the intention of that message, right? How big your organization is, what your company culture is. So also do take a peek at that. So for example, Simpraxis, it's 6 people. I can tell you right now, we don't use SharePoint News. That's super weird, right? There's only 6 of us. We're probably covering a lot of what we have in our Friday team meetings. So we're more on an org-wide team because we have so little to share so infrequently. So I will say this isn't a blanket assignment for everybody in the world to use SharePoint News, but it is the majority.
Yeah. We're 17 people, and we tried using SharePoint News, and we ended up on a Teams organizational channel. It works much better. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But as you get bigger, this certainly has a lot of power, and I love this over email that there's a historical context there. Somebody new joins the company, and guess what? They can actually see the historical news rather than it's locked in everybody else's inbox.
Yeah, we do the same thing, by the way, with a lot of my clients, where not only we'll make sure that everybody is communicating over, like news for news, but also like using Teams effectively, and that when we have meetings, that the outcome of meetings are captured somewhere in Teams, because a new team member joins the organization tomorrow, they're not, they can just go back and read all the content, as opposed to starting with a blank mailbox that has nothing in their email.
That's why I love OneNote.
Yes, I love.
Oh, I mean, don't get me started on OneNote. That's my other love.
Kindred spirits here.
I would be bold enough to say that OneNote changed my career in a heartbeat. So I was in HR and communications background, and we launched Microsoft 365. No one in our organization was using it, and I found it frustrating. So I was like, well, I'm going to learn about it and teach everyone about it. And I got approval to just do some lunch and learns. They would buy food, and I started off with OneNote, and it completely changed how the whole organization shared meeting notes, and I completely live on it. My personal life, my husband and I are on it. We've started fishing recently. We're keeping our fishing log there. Like, it just serves every need I have.
My life is in a collection of OneNote, so yeah, I'm the same.
For a while, it was
Oh.
my travel.
Yeah, not so much.
we have
lately.
a good question here. So, any tips around generational divide to gear folks off of the email always on way to consume news and everything else? Emily, I'm gonna pass that to you. See what you have to say about that.
That is a good one. So, always on. So is the intention behind that kind of saying that the younger generations are more willing to opt in to consuming
Correct.
it all the time? Okay.
Yeah. So the experience at Microsoft, in example, 200,000 employees with many generations, there's those that fall back to email, and that's the only way they consume things. Just wondering, like, what are some tips for those individuals that maybe their way that they're being taught and learned and live for 20 plus years?
So
how do you get
I
them
always
excited?
talk, yeah, I always talk about the concept of data, information, and knowledge, right? So data is zeros and ones. It means nothing. Information is when you take that data and you put it in context. That's when it starts having meaning. So for example, I could capture how often I put gas in my car. That means nothing. But if I laid it out against a calendar and I saw that every Mondays and every Fridays I put gas in my car, it means probably that I'm commuting somewhere during the week, right? And over the weekend, I'm doing something with my car, like I'm doing donuts in the parking lot or something, but I'm using gasoline. So just putting data in context makes it information. And then when you add the people that have all the knowledge to that information, that's when it becomes your own knowledge, right? So it's not other people's knowledge that becomes yours. Is you take that information, you use your old experience, and it becomes your knowledge. So when you look at email, we're basically dumping everything in a generic folder. You might as well file it under F for file, right? It's all one big giant inbox that has no context. Yeah, now you have conversation conversation threads and things like that, but it doesn't have that context that Teams has, because Teams you're able to actually communicate, or news you're able to communicate through the concept of a site collection or a group or a team. And so you're actually instantly giving context to that data, which would otherwise be data, and you're making it information. You're making it have meaning. So I'm not interested right now about I don't know, the manufacturing news for this one client, or the update for this this one group. I don't have to read it right now, but it's going to show up in my news when I start SharePoint. When I'm ready to go visit that site, I'm going to get these news, which is something I can't do with email. So right now with email, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore it, mark it as read, or not even mark it as read, or if I'm really fancy, I might flag it to get back to it later. Guess what? I'll probably never get back to it later, right? So it's really what it's about, is about taking that stuff that has no meaning, giving it a context so it starts having meaning. But because I can see the author of the article, I can see all the people that are interested in this article, I'm also putting you in touch with the people who have the knowledge, and it becomes more of a knowledge thing than just a piece of data. I know that's a super fast answer, long answer here. Sorry.
Oh, I'm going to make it longer.
Yeah.
To extend on your point, I'm hearing a lot of kind of building off of that. What's in it for me, right? So if I make SharePoint news better, more engaging, I'm reducing that gulf of execution and therefore making their jobs easier. There's a bit more incentive to engage with it that way. I will acknowledge, I don't think that you turn on news and you stop emailing. There's definitely some change management there. So I've seen some organizations start with the news digest and start to trickle off as they see higher engagement to help draw them there and get used to that different shift. So as long as we make it more valuable and kind of pull them over to where we want them to be slowly, I've seen that work pretty well. And I will say, as someone who's bucketed in the millennial group, I super hate everything being on all the time. So I will even say, like, I set some hard boundaries and I put, like sleep on my phone for some of my different apps so it doesn't bother me after a certain time. So make sure you're posting this news and sharing it at optimal times when people will be free and fresh to engage in it as well.
Right.
Yeah, and that's actually some of the metrics that I always bring it down to metrics with some of these stakeholders, because I can talk about the studies and they might listen to it, but ultimately if I say, hey, can you tell me how many people actually read this news that you sent via email? They'll say, well, I have read receipts. I'm like, well, I always turn off read receipts, so you definitely don't get my read receipts. And how do you know that they actually read all the way to the bottom, right? How do you know that they actually followed up on this? And this is the first thing that we can do with SharePoint News. And then if you look at all the metrics, you're even able to say at what time of the day are people interacting with these news more often. So that
Right.
helps you target the news to make sure that you basically target people when they're weakest, right? They're more readily available to consume your news. And it's almost like we had rehearsed this.
Yeah, we did have this as a hidden slide.
Nice.
So
yeah, so this is where show me this, the equivalent of this in your email, and then we can talk about why news is better than email.
I mean, one of the arguments I often make when I'm explaining to people why Teams and news and things like that is better than email is I go way back in time and say, okay, in decades past, when I only got a few dozen emails a day, and I don't remember how long ago that was, I would diligently organize them and I'd put them in folders and group them by projects and clients and topics and things like that so I could find them again later. Teams and news kind of turns that on its head. It's kind of building on what you said, Hugo, that it comes pre-organized for you. It's not one big black box that everything is in. It's, if I want to look at the news, it's there. If I want to look at the company channel, it's there. It's just so much easier to say, hey, what was that last week and where do I go find it? I know search is awesome, but it still leaves to be desired often when you're trying to find that nugget.
I had a large consulting firm that they had a great intranet site, right? And it was built on SharePoint, but they would have one page where they would have client information. And then in a completely separate area, they had all the projects that are going with this client. And in a completely separate area, they had an RSS feed about pretty much the industry, right? And all we did, and this is when I'm talking about data, right? All these things are data in themselves. They have no information. They have no meaning. But when you take those three things and you put them in one context, right? So let me look at this one client, right? Whatever the client is, Lazy Boy. I'm going to see Lazy Boy today. I can go to the Lazy Boy client. Are they still in business? I don't. I'm going.
Hard to tell these
I
days.
go to the Lazy Boy client, right? And now I can see the information about Lazy Boy. I can see all the projects that we have going on with Lazy Boy. And oops, this client's not happy with this project right now. And oh wait, here's news about the industry, or this company is in the news right now. So next time I'm going to meet with this client or talk to this client, all this stuff now has context. It becomes information that I can use, as opposed to having to search through these things. And I can promise you that the RSS feed page, nobody ever went to that page. So that's really what it's about.
Yeah, it becomes super useful to pull it all together.
Yeah.
Hey, do you mind if I steal for the last couple of minutes here? I want to throw some ideas out for upcoming topics. So we're not sure who's presenting next month, and I had a bunch in my back pocket here, so I'm just going to share my screen out, and I want to just take, I know we got a small group, but let's get a little quick feedback on thoughts and ideas here. So one of them was around Planner and Power BI integration. So it's a little pet project I'm doing with a couple of clients where Power BI out of the box doesn't know how to read Planner data. They're both Microsoft products, but go figure. So how do you harvest that data and pull it in and make use of it? So built some Azure automation, some PowerShell that uses Graph and pulls that Planner data and pushes it up into an Azure storage account. But then it also populates some SharePoint lists. So if I've got 100 different plans across my organization, I can start to segment them into portfolios, and then I can start to do dashboarding to say, hey, who's got what tasks, not just on one plan, but across multiple, because Planner will show you what you do, but not what everybody else is doing. So this kind of gives you that ability. So that's one topic, just kind of go through that scenario. I'm probably going to open source a bunch of this stuff, so throwing that out there. Next one is around development environments. We do a lot of 365 development, and we kind of insist with our clients that we have non-prod environments that have their own Azure AD and their own Office 365 tenant, and everything else is isolated so it works well, and they might have multiple of those. Managing all those environments becomes a real challenge. So we've set up a structure with some SharePoint lists that manage all the Azure subscriptions, Azure AD, SharePoint site collections, uses B2B, so that we can use our corporate credentials and access all these different environments and not have to remember, umpteen different credentials to get into all these different things. So it's just kind of a cool way to manage if you've got a lot of environments. This one's a bigger one that we've been working on for a while, which is around, employee self-service is the scenario, but really, how do we build forms in 365? There's lots of ways to do it. And one of the ways we found we really like is just straight up web stack, HTML, jQuery, whatever floats your boat from that point of view. But then how do you get that data into SharePoint? So we've got a little app service that the form is hosted in, so it's secure. We've got a web API that acts as a receiver so the form can submit it, and then that plugs it securely into Logic App. So it kind of wires all the pieces together from a security point of view quite nicely, but it gives us flexibility to say, hey, whatever we want to do from a business logic point of view, we can wire that up pretty easily in Logic App. You can submit that data back into SharePoint, could talk to SAP or other backend systems if it needs to around that. And then this last one is one we're just starting on now. It's around what we're calling structured document collection. So I love the OneDrive for Business feature where you can create a folder, create a link, and share it with people and say, here's a black box, just drop files in there, and you can collect videos like this that are big files and hard to collect from that point of view. But if you want people to do more, to say, hey, I want them to tag documents and organize them, it becomes a little tougher. You can give them access to a document library, but if they're not a regular SharePoint user, dragging and dropping documents in and then selecting them and setting their metadata, that's a bunch of steps and you're going to lose people on it. So can we have a really simple SPFX web part that I just drag some documents up on it, and it pops up, open a window, and says, I need this metadata on these documents. They fill it in, they submit, and it actually submits to a Logic App workflow. So we don't even give them rights to the underlying SharePoint, and then all the security, metadata, everything can be done from that point of view. So this one I see a lot of value to anybody that has external parties. They need to collect stuff from that point of view. So I did a quick little Microsoft Forms. Let me see if I've still got it here. Yeah, I'm going to post it out in the chat. So people can take a minute, even if they can't do it right now. Give me a 1 to 5 on those topics, and I'll randomly pick one of them, and maybe that'll be our February topic from there.
Awesome.
Yeah, I did have one more. Jack Lee said that he may be interested in. I just remembered that he had said that. So I will check back with him.
Awesome. Actually, I have a joint talk with Jack that's not on this list. That's more Azure focused. But yeah, I'd love to have him join the group too. Okay. But
I was gonna throw one other question about tonight's topic. Just speaking about the generational one, and thinking about my own kids who don't look at emails, and the only way you can communicate with them is if you sent them a Snapchat or something, right? And they're going to be going into the workforce very soon, and how are they going to communicate, and how are they going to, grab information, right? Like I send them an email right now because I have something to give them. I check with them in a week, and it's like, what email? It's like, you have an email address. You have a phone that's constantly on. It's like, what do you mean, what email?
You got to text after the email. That's the trick.
I guess that's where maybe our Teams connector comes in, because if you're thinking of where you're working and consuming and chatting, to have the Teams connector from your associated SharePoint site or others to be posting that news where you're already working. I think, that's kind of how we're consuming content on Twitter, right? We have limited characters, but then you click for this larger news post. So giving them that bite-sized, strong information sent with the link to the larger piece of news, I could see being impactful. Same with adding to Yammer.
Yeah, and having that in Teams is awesome. Actually, I was just twigged me on a side topic. I got an approval for a leave request from a staff member today in Teams, and we hadn't changed anything in our Power Automate. It used to be email, and it always bugged me. It's like, I never look at my inbox anymore. Everything is Teams for me. And now the approvals are coming through in Teams, and we didn't even have to do anything for it. It's pretty cool.
That's amazing.
So I do want to give a hearty thank you both to Hugo and Emily. Awesome topic tonight. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having us. It was fun.
It was fun. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
And I
thanks.
promise I'll anchor my feet next time, so I'm not going to be. I'm just going to be moving this
Emily's
way.
gonna mock you
I was
now.
getting
Yeah.
seasick. That's all.
I'll just do the opposite while, it'll
That's
be
right.
the whole thing.
Balance it out.
It's been
I was
great. Well,
wondering
thanks
if you were
everybody.
doing the floss
And,
behind the scenes. But
I'll put
it's-
some weight behind me.
So we've got our YouTube channel. I will endeavor to try and get the link up in there. We can't update the meetup after the fact, but we will post a message out in the group from there. Hugo or Emily, I don't know if you're comfortable sharing your slides. If there's a spot to share them, just chat that back to me through the meeting here, and happy to put that link up there as well.
Sure.
Absolutely. Thank
Awesome. Thanks again.
you. Have a good one.
Good night.
Bye.